I love marketing. There, I said it. And it's very unusual to find a physician with the same passion of marketing that I do. In fact, this pain management specialist even goes as far as saying to become a better physician, you need to become a better marketer, or at least understand how marketing works. And this physician definitely understood about marketing. He was one of the first earliest physician adopters of using podcasting as a marketing medium to share his message on how to treat chronic pain patients better. And in addition to his successful medical practice, he is the co host of another podcast, The Changed Physician, which I had the honor of being a part of. My interview with Dr. Kevin Cuccaro on this episode of Bootstrap MD. Hey guys, this is Dr. Mike Wuming. Welcome to another episode of Bootstrap MD. And I really have the honor of introducing my next guest. He is a fellowship trained specialist and the expert in the science of pain, trained in anesthesiology at University of Chicago, as well as got a pain medicine fellowship at my alma mater, University of Michigan. Go Blue. We won't talk about our football team this year. He also did some. He also spent some time here in my hometown here in San Diego at the Naval Medical Center in the Pain Medicine Fellowship Program. And he has a program called the Straight Shot Health, which actually led to him starting his own podcast way back when in 2013. And he also launched a web-based course the next year. He does himself as an online physicianpreneur, and that's why I needed to have him on the show. I've actually been honored to be a guest on his podcast, which I haven't checked it out. It's called The Changed Physician, where he is a co-host. So I bring to the show today Dr. Kevin Cuccaro. How are you doing, my friend?
Very well, Mike. How are you doing?
Doing well. You get all your holiday shopping out of the way, and
well, it's all computer based, right? It's like, it makes me think of first world problems or whatever. Because the issue this year is since we're doing everything, and we're pretty good about online shopping in general before the pandemic, but then we get all these packages, and nobody knows who's supposed to open them, right? Because we have me, my kids, my wife. We're all ordering stuff for each other, and then it's like, what do you do? Because you check the order, you're gonna know what you're gonna get, and so it's been an interesting thing. We just started throwing things underneath the tree, and it's gonna be an interesting Christmas. So,
well, at least it's more interesting than when I give to my family. We're just basically sending out the same Amazon gift card, like just back and forth. It just keeps on going back and forth there. So I wanted to have you on the program. As I mentioned, I've been on your show, which you guys need to check out. It's called The Change Physician. We're talking about how you actually kind of launched that. So, but I want to get back into, let's say, 2011, 2012. As you mentioned, you're a pain management specialist. What decided you to say, hey, you know what? I want to start my own podcast?
A lot of dissatisfaction, and probably with a lot of your audience, right? So we, as physicians, we went into healthcare, almost all of us, I think, because we wanted to help people get better. And so when I did anesthesia, and then I had an interest in pain, I did my fellowship in pain, and I was always interested in helping people get better. Now, if you've been practicing for a while, you kind of know that in the field of pain, there's not a lot of people getting better in a traditional practice. And so when I was in the military and we had 6 other fellowship trained physicians, all really, really well trained, I was finding it very frustrating that we would do this stuff. And obviously in a physician pain world, we're heavily interventionally focused. And we were doing all these injections, and yet couldn't tell who was getting better and who wasn't. Literally, some of us were super conservative, and some of my colleagues, again, really great guys and gals, but they were super aggressive. I would walk into a room and say, where is an injection? Or I should say, is an injection appropriate? And some of my colleagues are like, where is an injection appropriate? Mm. And it didn't seem to matter. So I thought it was the military model at the time. And then I left military medicine. I came to Oregon. There was no full-time pain specialist where I was. I was super dedicated to like evidence-based practice. I was following all the guidelines. And within 6 to 8 months, my outcomes were no different than what I was seeing in the military. Meaning
Mm.
people would walk into your office and they're like, oh, Dr. Cuccaro, I feel so much better. But then you look at the chart and, if I had done injections in their back, a month after that, they were seeing the orthopedic specialist and injections in their knee. A month after that, the rheumatologist and getting injections in the shoulder. And then they were back to me saying either their back or neck was hurting again. And I just didn't like that. I'm like, something's wrong. Like, we're supposed to help people get better so they go back to living their life, not seeing more and more physicians and getting more stuff done. So I started looking at, I started taking a really critical look at the evidence and data behind what I did. And I'm sure it's not shocking, again, to your listeners that when you look at the outcomes for pain, they're horrible. And a lot of, I would say not a lot, I'd say the majority of the things that we do in medical care have little to no evidence that supports them when you're looking at objective data. And the outcomes are atrocious. And when you're doing things to people that you think that are actually harming them, even if you're getting paid to do them, and you went into medicine to help people get well, there's a lot of dissonance with that. So I spent a lot of time going back and studying pain again, looking at all the science that we weren't actually taught in fellowship, which is kind of weird because I came from a pretty good program. So the science of pain has actually advanced quite a bit. The practice of pain is still stuck about 60 years behind.
Wow.
And really the model that we have is not set up to help people get well. And I was recognizing very, very quickly is in a typical medical practice, there's no resiliency and there's no flexibility in order to create that better pathway. Meaning we're all RVU generated. We're heavily procedural based. The procedures make a bunch of money. There's no time to do the education to really incorporate behavioral health techniques to get in a true multidisciplinary team. And yeah, so that's sort of what transitioned or accelerated my path into more of a physicianpreneurship domain. Meaning, I started looking at how does behavioral change occur. We've had actually a talk, I think, on our podcast about that, because that led me into direct response marketing, because you're like, well, who changes behavior or who gets people to take action? It's marketers. And then that kind of led into my podcast and trying to do two things. One is get people aware of the discrepancies in healthcare, or more of the sick care system. Like, what can you do for your health? And the second thing is then how do you create actionable programs that people can start and go through and actually have transformative results? And so that has sort of been what my focus has been over the last 7-8 years now. In working, again, mostly with clinicians, kind of trying to transform how they approach and treat pain through understanding it differently and applying different principles. So that's a super long way to say it was mostly from dissatisfaction with the current medical system and not seeing people get well.
Now, back then or currently, do you have your own practice or do you work for a hospital system?
No, I'm completely independent, and I had a small, almost like a micro practice for a while, but I closed it this last year, and the reason was to get your referral volume to make that even worth doing is really, really hard to do, and you have to actually educate, again, mostly the clinical population, because most people, when it comes to pain, aren't thinking about helping people get better. From the primary care perspective, it's often, well, who can I get to write these opioids for them? And that is not my focus at all. It's not the opioid side. So that physical practice I've actually shut down this year, but the vast majority even up until that point, 90 plus, was working with either healthcare systems or clinicians and teaching them pain. So I had a couple large scale grants in 2016. I got an extension on those in 2017. Had a couple big projects this year with healthcare systems and some tribal health clinics in Southern Oregon this year. So that's where I've been really kind of dwelling in that space.
So why back then? Because I'm thinking back in 2013, there wasn't a lot of podcasts out there. Why did you decide to use that medium? Then let's say, go to your local, your society and, put out a paper and all that. Why did you decide to use that medium?
That's I have never thought about that, to be honest. So I started doing a lot of presentation and speaking. So speaking for medical events, and I really, really enjoyed that. The actual podcast side, I think, honest to God, like right now you hear everybody saying, oh, podcasting is the future. You need to start a podcast. Well, they were saying that back in 2011, 2012. It was the same thing. It's just there was nobody podcasting at the time. And I thought, well, this would probably be a good way to do this. It would seem like an interesting media. And I like talking, like we're talking now. So that's really what precipitated that, I think. Again, I haven't had a chance to really think about it as much. Why did I do that? But I think it was just came up. There was no strategic plan. Mm-hmm. I knew I didn't really want to do a blog. And I think it just became an easy media. And I took a course from a guy who was a well-known podcaster at the time, slipped right into it. And just been kind of doing it since then. That particular podcast I don't publish nearly as persistently as you need to do. Like I'm sure from your experience, the key to podcasting is making sure that you're on a consistent publication schedule. That was probably the biggest learning thing I got from that.
It's still active, but you're not as frequent.
I haven't closed it. That particular podcast, and this is if you're thinking about podcasting, there's a couple of different things that you can use for it. One, you can do it for education, right? So from a marketing standpoint, you can use it to educate who your audience may be. Mm-hmm. The other thing, and what mine sort of transitioned to over time, is it became a very easy way for me to speak to experts about pain, like some of the world-renowned ones. Lorimer Moseley, if anybody knows him down in Australia. If you have a podcast, it becomes a very easy way to connect with people because you're like, hey, would you like to come on my podcast? And then you talk to them and then you do whatever. So there's sort of a network effect with that. And so what I do, I guess I'm sort of blowing my cover here, but what I do with that particular podcast now is use it as a connection, either to promote people I've worked with. So now they have an audience to see the good things that they've done, and or to connect with people that I think are fascinating. It's easier than saying, hey, can I pick your brain for your 20 minutes in a coffee shop? No people want to have their brains picked in a coffee shop, but if you want to talk on a podcast, people will definitely talk on a podcast.
And what, and you've alluded to this, but just want to be sure, what has led from that podcast? What kind of doors has that opened for you?
I think really connecting with people that you normally wouldn't have an opportunity to connect with. If you're looking at it from a business side and you start, it's probably a little bit harder now than it was then. It just sounds so much better. Like there's something in it for the interviewer or the interviewee that you have, if you have something to offer them. If you're doing something like, hey, I really like what you do, but I want to sit down and talk to you. Other than the good graces and someone feeling good about helping somebody, which is a great reason to do it, there really isn't anything long-term for that individual. But if you have a podcast now, at least they know, if I go and educate you and I ask you these questions and we're having a great discussion, somebody else may hear about that and they may discover me that way. And so I think a podcast, again, you can do this in different media, but a podcast is so much easier to have a great discussion. And so it allows that kind of give and take relationship in a way that is beneficial to both parties. I am always kind of shocked if you have somebody who refuses a podcast. People forget, like once you have a podcast episode up, it's there forever unless the podcast stops publishing. And people will find stuff that you published 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago in some scenarios that you would never have ordinarily connected with. So it's great for the podcaster because you can connect with people that you really want to talk to, and it's great for the person being interviewed because now you have this asset that's sitting in the interwebs that basically will last as long as people are paying the hosting fee, and that's pretty amazing.
Remember when you could practice medicine on your own terms? What if you could take control of your physician career, make more money while working smarter, not harder? Pick up your copy of The Positioned Physician. Earn more, work smart, and love medicine again. Now updated for 2021, The Positioned Physician details one doctor's journey from burnt-out employee to successful entrepreneur. Whether you are in residency, in mid-career, or close to retirement, after reading The Positioned Physician, you'll gain the knowledge that can strategically impact your doctor life. The Positioned Physician, now available on Amazon Kindle and paperback.
Yeah, just so funny. Just yesterday, I get an email from an interview I did, pre-COVID, which I can't even remember.
Yeah.
And they like something that I said back then, and I'm like, I don't even remember what I said back then. But You're right; it's permanent, and you have all of these distribution channels. Why not take advantage of it? I'm just kind of curious. how did, and just kind of being a geek, how did your audio equipment, has it changed from 2013 to today, or?
No, the guy I took the course with, I'm not even sure if he does podcasts anymore, because he did it for so long, and then he kind of transitioned. He wanted to be like the Tony Robbins that didn't cuss. And but his name's Cliff Ravenscraft, and he had like, you know, Cliff,
I know of him. I don't know him personally, but
so he hardcore, and he's super hardcore audiophile. So we're in this course, and he's like, "This is what you need. You need this microphone. You need." I'm like, oh, "That's a $600 microphone. You need this." And I didn't get the $600 microphone, but he got us. He said, "Get a soundboard, get an external recording device, get this," and because of that kind of foundation, which was overkill, I think, in a lot of ways, but I haven't had to change anything. Like, it's all hardware. I'm looking at it right now, and it's still working really, really good because it was quality equipment. And so I haven't had to do anything there, which is kind of nice, right?
That's very cool. That's very cool.
Yeah.
And just so that people on the audience know, the name of the podcast is Straight Shot Health Talk.
Straight Shot Health Talk. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. So you got your practice, you got this podcast that you're doing on the side. When did you decide to say, hey, you know what? I want to do a second podcast?
That one came about with a desire to meet dynamic people again. So in the pain world, there's a lot of passion surrounding pain. The conversations oftentimes get overshadowed by the whole opioid issue. There's some really fantastic people, and there's some amazing things that occur, but there's a lot of anger too, and they're rightly so on many different sides. And that kind of negativity gets a little rough at times. And so with the podcast, my co-host, Dr. Melissa Cady, who is also anesthesia and pain trained, who doesn't do interventions anymore, we're like, well, we need to get around positive people. And the people that we enjoyed to be around were entrepreneurs, and specifically physician entrepreneurs. And so the reason we started that podcast then was to connect with other physician entrepreneurs so that you, in some ways, maintain your own sanity. Because I know you felt this way, Mike, is like, when you're thinking on your own and working out in the ethers of the internet, it's real, you feel isolated, right? There is nobody seems to understand what you do. Everybody looks at you like you're crazy. Like, what do you don't practice for the hospital? You're not employed. You're doing this thing, blah, blah, blah. And it's hard to talk to people. Like, you can't talk about, you can't necessarily talk about the purpose of a podcast or lead generation or solutions, creating solutions and things, because people have no idea what you're talking about. So with that particular podcast, again, it's meeting physicians, predominantly entrepreneurs. And the other back end of that is to encourage physicians specifically. There's this whole burnout thing. And I don't necessarily like the burnout per se, but there's a lot of physicians feeling trapped. And our purpose there is to say, there's so many opportunities for physicians if you're thinking differently. And that was another reason to do it, is meet a lot of people who are already thinking differently, encourage other physicians to start thinking differently, because ultimately the solutions for the future of healthcare are going to come from us, but they're not going to be in this, regular, the traditional medical model is not going to be where healthcare transformation comes from. It's going to come from physician entrepreneurs devising the solutions for the 21st century.
I'm curious, how did you and Dr. Cady meet? You met before, or was there like some type of podcast physician society that you got together on?
No, it came from pain. It came from pain. It was pain. It was, we met through pain. Now it was, we had another physician colleague. There's a couple like lights out in the dark. We all started connecting. They introduced me to Melissa. We actually went up to a specific, again, more pain specific event in Seattle, I think in 2018, and just kind of hit it off. She interviewed me for a project that she has. I think I brought her onto my podcast. We had another podcast we briefly run for about almost 40 episodes, I think. It was in more pain specific, and then we decided to transfer it into a more positive audience. Yeah, so we had a project before the Change Physician.
So what kind of interesting, I guess, observations can occur having a co-host versus doing it on your own? I mean,
So much easier. So much easier. So much like so Straight Shot Health. The hard thing with that particular podcast when I started, it was just me, because I did the mistake of one of the things in entrepreneurship is you learn to model, right? And most podcasts were doing these interview-based podcasts, which they're still doing now. And I'm like, well, I don't want to. Everybody's doing an interview podcast. I'm not going to do an interview podcast. I'm going to be solo episodes. Well, generating solo content that you can then discuss in a way that flows well is really, really, really hard to do. And especially when you're not sure if anybody's listening, because nobody's listening to you when you start. With a co-host, what that allows you to do is it's just so much more dynamic, because there's always this dialogue. Like you and I, because we can have a conversation. Now we have no idea where this podcast is going to go. As long as we're not babbling, it should be interesting for the audience.
Hey, don't give away all my secrets here.
But they're going to get something out of it, right? And so the advantages of having a co-host is what we've even seen with. So when we have a guest on, now we have two of us, and oftentimes one of us will take the conversation in a way that I didn't even anticipate. So it's synergistic in a lot of ways. It's more fun, and then the other part is, of course, you can split the labor. Like Melissa's more technically minded. She can do things with like editing that I have no idea what she does. I can do a little bit more on the marketing side. So and you have a built-in accountability buddy too. That's the other thing. Like even when you feel like not doing it, all of a sudden you get the email, hey, we have an interview in 2 hours or whatever. And so it's been great to have a partner.
Now and just the name of that podcast, that's called The Change Physician. I encourage you guys to check it out. I've had the pleasure of doing 2 episodes with you. You've also been able to attract some really interesting guests. I'm trying to see the one that they came across. I forgot his name, but he's from the UK. He's big in productivity.
Yeah, Ali Abdul. Yeah.
Yeah, and so he's got like 1 million followers. That's kind of one of my bucket list ones to get. How were you able to get a hold of him?
Yeah, Melissa just reached out. And again, it comes down to you have a podcast, and it really comes down to reaching out to individuals, and then making sure that it's in a way that is constructive, right? You're not asking for anything other than time, although that can be a huge deal. What's really great about Ollie is he's just a great guy. And we had reached out to him before he was 1 million. He had 1 million YouTube subscribers. But he's actually, he was very conscious, and he's like, he's been publishing stuff he's young. He's like 20, 25, 26. I think he's been doing stuff online for at least 10 years. So he started in his late teens. And he is just a really giving guy. And he's like, I always want to make time for people who are doing things. And so he was happy to do it. Now there's been a lot of other people who have 1 million plus YouTube subscribers that haven't responded. So it doesn't always happen with everybody. But you ask, and people who understand will often say, hey, I remember what it was like when you're starting something new, or before I had, 1 million or even 100,000 subscribers. And so it was fun to talk with him, and also to get his perspectives on a different style of medicine. Because I know if you watch some of his other, that episode that he did with us, there's always this grass is greener thing with physicians. Oh, if you go to the UK, it's better for you. You go to Canada, it's better. We've had Canadian doctors on, and it was really interesting to hear their stories of burnout. And then Ollie is like completely different. He makes way more money through his online ventures than he will ever make through medicine. So, and to see how he did that was a treat.
Yeah. And I think he's actually coming to the US, he's put his medicine, last time I checked, he's put his medical career on hold just because he's just doing so well online.
Yeah, well, they so the system they have is a little bit different. So once the junior doctor, which is kind of like being a resident in the United States, and it's really, really typical apparently in the UK health system that when you finish that junior doctor status, a lot of them take like a year off. Like, so we were like, oh, that's something that you're doing is completely. And he's like, no, actually, a lot of us, they're like, you've been killing yourself for so long, take a year off, and then they go into whatever next, whether they're doing general practice or they're going to try to do specialty training. And so he was aware of this. He wanted to take this break. I'm not sure if he will go back. And if he does, it'll be in a very limited manner. But Yeah, it was really interesting because that's so different. You know, what do we do here is like medical school, residency, fellowship, you're in fellowship. It's like, where can I get started? It's like, freaking take a break, you know, like
Yeah.
relax a little bit, figure out what you want to do. But
yeah, I don't remember. I guess the only break I took was because I trained in Arizona and I was just waiting for my California license to come in. And so I got, you know, other than that, I didn't really give you a break.
The forced vacations, right? Because
Yeah.
licensure or hospital privileging or whatever.
I do want to talk about something that we both have a love of is direct marketing. And you kind of talked to me about how I got into it. I'm interested in how you got interested in it. It doesn't seem like something would be part of a pain specialist curriculum to learn about.
Yeah, well, that comes down to that frustration.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it comes down to, again, you're looking at the data on pain, and you're looking that it's universally atrocious, and then what kept coming up is these few kind of indicators, and they were all behaviorally oriented, like changing in coping style, changing in pain beliefs, distress management, and things. And so I'm like, well, we need to actually work at helping people to kind of facilitate change within them. And then as they do that, and then they can move and they can exercise, and we decrease fear, avoidance beliefs, and all this other stuff. And I remember thinking, well, how do you get people to change their behavior? Right. Because we aren't doing it. And that first actually led to the book Switch by Chip Heath and Dan Heath, which is all about organizational and behavioral change. And that one blew my mind because it was like, information doesn't change behavior, which, I mean, you know that, I know that. It sounds so stupid to say, but at that moment I read it, I was like, holy crap, this explains everything. Because we're always handing out a form and thinking that the patient's going to all of a sudden radically if I give them this little sheet of paper that says quit smoking, they're going to quit smoking. No, it doesn't work. We know this doesn't work, right? So I made this thought, and this was one of the little hints of luck. I'm like, well, who gets people to take action? And I go, well, salespeople do. And so then I started listening to a bunch of podcasts and watching interviews with salesmen and marketers. And I didn't even know what marketing was at that point. And the more I learned about marketing and the sales process, the more I saw it was directly relevant to behavioral change. Because if you can get someone interested, you can develop that interest into a motivation, and then you can then get them to want to take an action based on that, because now it's in their best interest to do so. That's a skill that's super useful. And when you look at marketing, like as we had talked about, there's two types. There's like the advertising brand marketing, which is what we typically think of when someone says, oh, you're advertising. And that stuff is garbage unless you're Coke. Like, unless you already have, everybody knows you and you're just trying to keep a level of awareness, it doesn't help you.
Yeah.
But direct response, then when you start seeing it and you start seeing it everywhere, it's just amazing. And it's been utilized for over 100 something years. The sales principles that they've been doing in the early 1900s, they're still using them now. And then what I also love about it is then if you start looking at the psychological literature, so from social psychology, behavioral psychology, cognitive psychology, now we're knowing why these things work. Why do these triggers actually work? And so it started in an interest of trying to get people to change behavior. And now it's just a fascination. I just love it. I think it's the most fascinating thing. I like breaking down ads, like to see how people's funnels lay, because it's just intellectually fulfilling to me. I just love it.
I know, but what it does though, it actually kind of ruins it for some people, because I would be mentioning it like we're watching something on TV, and I'll say something, and to my wife, we're like an infomercial comes up. You know why they're doing this, right? Right here. This is all scarcity and urgency here that they're doing here. And she goes, "Oh, just lay off."
Did you just start
watching? No, I think you do kind of do the same thing. Is you kind of break these down, and you're seeing all all of them. What other books you mentioned? The Heath brothers. Other books that you've liked?
Well, for health specifically, the Heath brothers I think was a big one. It depends on if you're looking at marketing or if you're looking at pain and health. There's or just the way that you think, because that's what the marketing has really kind of got me into thinking about how you think about things. They're completely unrelated to everything we talk about. There's a book called How Emotions Are Made by Lisa Feldman Barrett. that is really about how our experiences are constructed. And that kind of pulls together a lot of stuff that I learned from the science of pain and pulls together some of the marketing principles. There was another good one this particular year, again, kind of relating to information and behavioral change and much more relevant to the political situation, that was called Mistakes Were Made, But Not by Me, which is, again, there's a couple psychologists involved with that. Aronson, who's a pretty well-known guy, that talks about cognitive dissonance theory, which again is kind of related to marketing principles again, and tells you why we have such a polarized society. And some of the, the dangers and opportunities there, which are kind of frightening. Those, so I would probably start there. If you're going to start with anything, if you're new on the physician journey and you're kind of wondering why, like, if we know lifestyle and behavioral change is necessary, we're spending 90% of healthcare dollars on the treatment of lifestyle and behavioral disease, i.e. chronic diseases, and why what we do doesn't work, I would start with the Heath Brother book, the Switch, because that kind of gives you an introduction of really this whole idea of handing out the pamphlet and then complaining that your patients are non-compliant is completely ridiculous, as we're not doing what we need to be doing.
So do you, in your own practice, do you use some of these strategies?
All the time? No, I incorporate change theory and marketing principles in my presentations. If I'm doing a CME event, I will build them like I do a sales presentation, because it's the same thing, right? Because if we've all been in a super boring CME lecture and the person's like blabbing out data or whatever, and it doesn't serve anybody. But if you're like, okay, what am I going to do with this audience? If I want to change their behavior, I want to increase a level of awareness in them. How am I going to structure my presentation in a way to do that? So what's my introduction going to be like? How am I going to take this concept and simplify it in a way that makes it interesting to them? So I use it all the time. I mean, everything that I do kind of defaults back into, well, how do we influence people? How do we persuade them? How do we get people to change? What's the best way that I can communicate? And then learning that foundation from direct response marketing, then it kind of flows through you in everything. You're talking to people live, you do it. The way you write an email, it happens. If you're doing not even a sales presentation, any sort of presentation, it's reflected in that. And so I use it all. It's fundamentally changed my life and how I see it in the world. And it's fun. It's like the Matrix, right? You step into it and you're in a whole different, you can never go back. Yeah. But I'm glad to be there. And luckily we're not stuck in a weird submarine thing, shaved heads and eating nasty mush like they were in the Matrix. Is actually better.
I thought that was just Oregon. Okay, that's Oregon. But as you mentioned, too, with that, because when you go down that rabbit hole, because not only has it been in it for hundreds of years, it's like in the Spider-Man movie with power comes great responsibility, where we see things where they take it to the nth degree when you realize, oh my gosh, those same techniques are used to form cults, yep. Right? And why did they? I was turning on HBO and they had the documentary on the that was it Halley's Comet, back in the night,
Heaven's Gate,
and it's just like, how were they influenced? Well, if you watch some of the things, it's the authority figure, it's it's changing the behavior. That's why when you look at this stuff, you realize how powerful it could be, and especially if it gets into the wrong hands, that's what can happen. But if you can utilize it and understand it, I think it'll make you a better physician.
I totally agree. And I think the best, like the marketers who understand the responsibility behind the hand, they'll even warn on that. Like John Carlton, I'm sure is a pretty famous copywriter. Yeah. In his course, I think lesson 1 is, I will not use these things for evil. Like literally, there's the little page in there. I can't remember if you're supposed to sign it, but because it's a tool, and you can use it in a really bad way, or you can do it in a really good way. And rather than to put our heads in the sand and say, I'm a physician, I don't have to learn this stuff, blah, 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 blah. You better learn it, because if you're not learning it, then the unethical dude down the street who is a hack, he's learning, I guarantee it, or she, and is going to pull your patients away and do substantial harm. So learn as much about sales and marketing as you possibly can, just so that at a minimum so that you can defend yourself and others from the bad users, and perhaps use it on the good side, like, I don't know, the dark side and the good side of the force.
We could talk this forever. I know you've got to go. Where can they go to get more information about yourself, your podcast, website? What's the best way?
Well, for your particular audience, probably the best place to go is thechangephysician.com. And so the Change Physician is where, that's our podcast between me and Melissa Cady. And we have a little community there. We're always looking for interesting guests that have wonderful stories and are, transforming themselves and not settling this realm of, I'm going to let other people tell me what to do. And so that's probably the best place to go. If for whatever reason I sparked an interest in pain, you can go to straightshot.health.com, and some of the work that I've done there is there. Or they can just email me. Dr. Kevin at straightshot.health.com is probably the easiest way.
Kevin, thank you so much. It was, you got a great brain for understanding all of this, putting things together. I love what you're doing in the pain community. Just, kudos to yourself, and, all the best for you, and have a wonderful holiday.
Yeah, you too, Mike. And it's always fun to talk with you. And I was just thinking as we're finished, thinking, man, we need a physician podcast or some sort of secret group where we can talk about sales and marketing. How cool would that be? But thank you for having me on the show. It was a pleasure. It's always great to talk to you. I love what you're doing and have been doing it for so long. You're like the godfather of physicianpreneurs. So it's an absolute pleasure to be talking to you. But thanks for having me on the show.
Well, with the godfather, right? I'm making an offer you can't refuse. So thanks, everybody. Thank you again, Kevin. And as always, guys, keep moving forward.